He thought he was only searching for peace in a broken house on the outskirts of Vermont. But when his loyal canine began to dig in the storm and the basement wall crumbled to reveal a hidden room, everything changed. Inside were drawings, a diary, and the truth of a girl the powerful tried to erase. What he uncovered would challenge an entire town and prove that silence can bury secrets, but never forever. This story is not about ghosts. It is about memory, justice, and a soldier who refused to turn away. You won't forget this one. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to my channel to watch the next stories by clicking the subscribe button right below this video. Thank you. Amen. The rain had stopped just before dawn, leaving the world washed in a brittle gray stillness that clung to the hills of rural Vermont. It was early April when the snowmelt had already swelled the brooks and rivers, but the trees remained skeletal, branches like black fingers clawing at a pale sky. The air smelled of wet earth and pine sap, sharp and clean, though the wind that whispered down from the green mountains still carried the bite of winter. On the edge of a narrow road, where the asphalt cracked into gravel and the gravel into grass, stood a house, or what had once been one. Its roof sagged at the crown, shingles scattered like loose teeth. Vines, brown and brittle from winter, crawled across the clapboard siding as if they were trying to hold the walls upright. A porch leaned at a dangerous angle, and every window was a hollow socket, glass long gone, dark gaps staring outward into the mist. Locals called it the Renford Place, though no Renfords had lived here for decades. They said it was cursed. They said only a fool or a broken man would buy it. Ethan Cole, standing before it now, supposed that might be accurate. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, but carrying himself with a stiffness that betrayed injuries hidden beneath his coat. His hair, once dark, had been cut close in the military style he had never quite abandoned, streaked with the first threads of gray, though he was only 36. His face was the face of a Marine who had seen too much and survived more than he wanted. Strong jawline, scar tracing his left temple, deep-set eyes of steel blue that seemed to look through rather than at people. He had the gait of a man trained to march but slowed by years of shrapnel and torn muscle. To strangers he looked unyielding, but up close there was a hollowness, as though his spirit walked half a step behind his body. Ethan had been a staff sergeant in the United States Marine Corps, deployed in Iraq and later Afghanistan. He had led patrols through cities turned to dust, watched friends vanish in the thunder of roadside bombs, dragged bleeding men through firestorms of bullets. Yet it wasn't combat that carved the deepest wound in him. It was what waited at home. 3 years ago, while he was stationed in Helmand Province, his wife, Marissa, and their 8-year-old son, Caleb, had died in a highway collision caused by a drunk driver. Ethan had flown home draped in medals, but the medals had meant nothing in the face of 2 coffins lowered into the ground. After the funeral, the Marine Corps offered him leave, counseling, and finally discharge. He accepted only one thing: his dog, Shadow. Shadow was a German Shepherd, 7 years old, lean but powerful, with sable black and tan fur thick around the neck, one ear slightly notched from a firefight. His eyes were a molten amber, intelligent and watchful. In the war, he had been trained to detect explosives, to scout buildings, to save lives with a bark or a pull of his handler's sleeve. More than once, Shadow had dragged Ethan from a blast site. The bond between them was not one of owner and pet, but of brothers in arms, 2 survivors linked by memory and scars. Shadow moved with a soldier's alertness, ears swiveling, paws deliberate, as though every step carried consequence. Now, in the soaked yard of the Renford house, Ethan adjusted the strap of the duffel slung across his shoulder and looked up at the broken roofline. He wasn't here because the house promised comfort. He wasn't here because he believed in second chances. He was here because silence was cheaper in Vermont than anywhere else, and silence was all he wanted. His goal was simple: to find a place where no one asked questions, where the noise of memory might finally be smothered by the creak of old wood and the whisper of trees. Shadow padded to the porch steps and stopped. His body stiffened, ears tilting back. A low rumble started in his chest, not loud but steady, the kind of growl that spoke of warning rather than threat. Ethan frowned. "It's just a house," he muttered, stepping past him. The porch groaned beneath his weight. When he reached the door, Shadow still hadn't moved, paws frozen on the wet grass. Amber eyes locked on the threshold, as though an invisible barrier barred him. The key turned reluctantly in the rusted lock. The smell inside was a mixture of rot, mildew, and something else. Old dust soaked with rain, maybe, or time itself gone stale. The hallway opened into a living room with a fireplace blackened by decades of soot. Wallpaper peeled in curls, revealing plaster that crumbled at a touch. The floorboards moaned with each step. Ethan dropped his duffel onto the ground, and the thud echoed strangely, as if the house were hollow in places it shouldn't be. Behind him, Shadow crept across the threshold at last, but his posture was wary, his nose low to the ground, every muscle coiled. He paused at the doorway to the basement, a crooked wooden hatch leading downward, and released a sharp, uneasy whine. "Not today," Ethan told him, though the words felt more like a plea than an order. That afternoon he drove into the nearby town of Maplebridge, 10 miles away, to pick up supplies: a propane stove, nails, plywood, canned food. Maplebridge was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and strangers stood out like ink on white cloth. The general store was run by Hank Doyle, a heavy-set man in his late 50s with thinning brown hair and a permanent squint. Hank wore a red flannel shirt tucked into faded jeans, a belt straining at his waist. He greeted Ethan with the cautious politeness of someone who had already heard the gossip. "You're the fellow who bought the Renford place," he said, half statement, half disbelief. Ethan nodded, stacking canned beans on the counter. Hank pursed his lips, shaking his head slowly. "That house. Folks around here don't touch it. Too much rot. Too much history." He left the word hanging as though daring Ethan to ask. When Ethan didn't, Hank gave a humorless chuckle. "Well, it's your funeral, Marine." Outside, a woman lingered by the store's bulletin board. She was tall and angular, her hair a wiry crown of silver pulled into a bun, her coat buttoned high against the chill. This was Lorna Pike, one of Maplebridge's oldest residents, known for her sharp tongue and sharper memory. She peered at Ethan with a gaze that could strip paint. "You'll regret it," she told him flatly. "Men before you thought they could tame that house. Didn't last a season." Then she turned and walked away, boots striking hard against the pavement. Ethan loaded his truck without a word. He had grown used to pity and dismissal since the Corps, and he wore them like another scar. Yet as he drove back through the winding roads, the comments stuck to him like burrs. He had wanted only solitude, but solitude here seemed laced with something heavier, something the town feared enough to warn him against. When he returned to the house, dusk had settled, the sky bruised purple behind the trees. He unloaded the supplies into the kitchen, whose ceiling sagged dangerously. Shadow followed but kept circling back to the basement door, ears twitching, tail stiff. Later, as Ethan spread his sleeping bag in what had once been the parlor, the dog stationed himself at the threshold of the hall, gaze never straying far from the dark hatch. Night fell in silence, save for the drip of water somewhere in the walls. Ethan lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his body aching from travel, his mind circling memories he tried not to touch. At 2 a.m, Shadow's growl pulled him from near sleep. The dog stood, hackles raised, staring at the basement door. Ethan listened. The house was still, yet beneath the stillness he thought he heard something faint. A scrape, a shift, like wood straining against stone. He held his breath. Then it was gone. He rose, crossed the floor, placed a hand on Shadow's head. The dog's ears flicked, but his body remained tense, fixed on that single place. Ethan whispered, "It's just old wood." He repeated it like a mantra, though his gut told him otherwise. Still, he had come here for silence, and silence he would force upon himself. He returned to the sleeping bag, pulled the blanket over his chest, and closed his eyes. But Shadow did not lie down again. He stood vigil until dawn, eyes burning in the dim light, a soldier who sensed an enemy no one else could see. The days settled into a rhythm that wasn't quite peace, but at least it was routine. Ethan spent his mornings clearing debris from the yard, hauling rotten boards from the porch, and hammering temporary patches over gaps in the roof. He wasn't much of a carpenter, but the Marines had taught him the art of survival, and repair was just another form of survival. The afternoons he used to explore each room, sweeping out rat droppings, boarding up broken windows, and writing a list of supplies for his next run into Maplebridge. At dusk, he boiled beans on the propane stove, shared the can with Shadow, and tried not to look at the basement door, which seemed to lean more crookedly every night. It wasn't just the smell or the damp that unsettled him about the house, it was the sound. On the second night, as he lay in the sleeping bag on the parlor floor, the noise came again, a faint scrape, a cack, cack, as though nails dragged lightly against wood from underneath the floorboards. He propped himself on one elbow, holding his breath. Shadow had already risen, standing rigid, ears locked forward, eyes fixed on the same corner of the room. The sound came once more, then silence, heavier than before. By the fourth night, the noises were constant, almost rhythmic, like something working patiently at the wood from the other side. Ethan told himself it was rats, perhaps raccoons, maybe pipes straining in the cold. But Vermont nights were quiet, and this sound was too deliberate, too measured. Each scrape seemed aimed directly at him. Shadow's growls confirmed it wasn't imagination. During the day, Ethan forced his attention to repairs. He removed a door that had rotted from its hinges and used it to shore up the kitchen wall. He patched a hole in the roof with tarps weighted by bricks. Yet whenever he entered the basement, Shadow followed, but would not cross the halfway point down the stairs. Instead, the dog would plant himself in the shadows, hackles high, eyes locked on the far wall where the stone met crooked timbers. One patch of masonry there bulged outward, as if swollen from inside. Shadow would emit a low growl, the kind that resonated from his chest until it vibrated in Ethan's bones. Ethan tested the wall with his fist once. The thud sounded hollow. He told himself it was nothing. On the seventh day, while hammering shingles, Ethan realized he needed more supplies: roof nails, plaster, batteries. He drove into Maple Bridge in the old truck that coughed and groaned on every incline. The town was small, a cluster of brick and wooden storefronts arranged around a narrow main street. A church steeple rose above the rooftops, and beyond that the hills rolled away, scarred with maple farms. Ethan parked outside the general store and stepped onto the sidewalk, adjusting his cap against the brisk wind. It was there he first met Grace Miller. She was standing on the steps of the post office, arms filled with a stack of graded papers bound with twine. Grace was in her early 30s, slender but not frail, with a quiet strength that showed in the way she held her shoulders. Her hair was chestnut brown, long, and usually tied back in a loose braid that slipped strands across her pale cheeks. She wore a dark wool coat that hung to her knees, boots muddy at the soles from the walk across town. Her eyes, hazel flecked with green, carried a softness but also a guarded intelligence, the look of someone who had seen disappointment but refused to let it harden her completely. Grace taught literature at Maple Bridge Middle School, though teaching here was less a profession than a calling. She had returned to her hometown after years away, hoping to give something back to children who too often left with no intention of returning. But Grace carried her own quiet grief. Her younger brother, Thomas, had drowned in the river behind their house when she was 16. She had been the one to find him, and ever since, she had carried guilt like a stone in her pocket. That loss had made her protective, almost maternal, to every student she encountered. When she saw Ethan, she paused, balancing the papers on one hip. "You're the one who bought the Renford place," she said, her voice low but clear. It wasn't judgmental, not like the townsfolk, whispers more curious, tinged with concern. Ethan nodded. "Yeah, fixer-upper." Grace studied him a moment, her eyes flicking to the scar on his temple, to the tired set of his jaw. Then she offered a faint smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "That house has history," she said. "Not the kind you can cover with paint. Be careful." Ethan grunted, loading supplies into his truck bed. He had grown skilled at dismissing concern, yet something in her tone gave him pause. It wasn't gossip. It was warning, born of sincerity. He looked at her, really looked, and saw someone who had carried her own burdens. He almost asked what she meant, but stopped himself. He didn't want to know. Not yet. Back at the house, the weather turned. A nor'easter storm swept across the valley, hammering the roof with sheets of rain. Wind howled through gaps in the boards, rattling loose shutters like bones against stone. Ethan sat by the propane stove, a mug of instant coffee warming his hands, Shadow at his feet. The dog was restless, pacing back and forth, ears twitching with every creak. That night, the noises grew louder. The familiar cack came not only from the floor, but from the basement wall itself, reverberating faintly through the timbers. Ethan tried to ignore it, but sleep refused to come. He rose at midnight, flashlight in hand, and descended the stairs into the basement. The air was damp, colder than the rest of the house, carrying a metallic tang that made him think of rust or blood. Shadow followed halfway, then stopped, growl rumbling. The beam of light cut across the wall. The bulging section of masonry seemed almost alive in the shifting shadows, as though it breathed with the rhythm of the wind. Ethan pressed the beam close. The mortar lines here were rougher, uneven compared to the rest, as though someone had bricked it in a hurry. He placed his palm flat. Cold seeped instantly through his skin. The wall did not just look wrong, it felt wrong, as though it was less a barrier than a lid. He stood there for a long time, listening to the scrape echo faintly beyond the bricks. Finally he whispered, "Old house. Rats." But the words carried no conviction. The next morning he found muddy paw prints on the kitchen floor. Not shadows, the size was smaller, more delicate. They trailed from the basement door to the far corner and vanished. Ethan scrubbed the floor clean, telling himself it was residue from the storm, yet the prints had shape too defined, too deliberate. In town later that day, he encountered Grace again, this time outside the school where she was shepherding children into waiting buses. She wore a green scarf that whipped in the wind, her cheeks flushed from the cold. When she saw Ethan approach, she excused herself from the children and stepped closer. "You look tired," she observed softly. "House keeps me busy," Ethan replied. Her eyes searched his, catching a flicker of unrest he hadn't meant to reveal. She lowered her voice. "You hear it yet?" Ethan blinked. "Hear what?" "The house," Grace said simply. "Everyone who stays long enough hears it. Scratching, knocking, sometimes voices. My mother used to say it wasn't the house at all, but what was buried under it. That's why people left. That's why they won't speak about it." Ethan stiffened. "Rats," he muttered. Grace shook her head. "Be careful," she repeated, the same words she had said before, but now heavier, as if layered with memory. She didn't explain further, only turned back to her students, her voice bright again as she guided them into the bus. That evening, as dusk swallowed the valley, Ethan returned to the house with supplies. He patched another section of roof, secured boards over the upstairs windows, then sat at the table with a lantern burning low. The scratches came again, louder this time, echoing beneath his chair. Shadow pressed against his leg, teeth bared. Ethan thought of Grace's words, of Hank Doyle's half-warnings, of the way old Lorna Pike had looked at him like he was already doomed. He clenched his fists, staring at the floorboards. "It's just a house," he whispered. But even as he said it, the lantern flickered and the sound came again, 3 deliberate knocks from the wall below, patient and undeniable. Shadow growled, the sound reverberating through the hollow house. The storm rolled in before dawn, a slate-colored wall of water and wind that battered the hills of Vermont until the valleys turned into rivers. Rain came down in sheets, drumming against the roof of the Renford house, leaking through gaps Ethan hadn't yet patched, pooling in corners of the kitchen where buckets now sat catching steady drips. The storm didn't let up for hours, and Ethan sat in the parlor with Shadow pressed close against his leg, the propane stove giving off a faint metallic warmth. The dog's fur smelled damp, his amber eyes flashing whenever lightning split the windows with silver. Ethan had been through sandstorms that buried vehicles and firefights that shook the desert with thunder, but there was something about the storm's persistence here that gnawed at him. It felt less like weather, more like pressure. When the rain finally relented by mid-afternoon, the air outside was sodden, every step sinking into mud that sucked at boots. Ethan stepped onto the porch to survey the damage. Branches had snapped, the yard was drowned, and the earth sloped into a wide puddle near the edge of the tree line. Shadow padded past him, tail rigid, nose low. The German shepherd moved with sudden urgency, breaking into a run across the sodden grass. He skidded to a halt near the far corner of the yard where the ground had shifted and without hesitation began digging. Clods of wet earth flew behind him, his paws striking with frantic rhythm. "Shadow, enough!" Ethan shouted, trudging across the lawn, mud sucking at his boots. But the dog didn't stop. His growls deepened, more guttural, the kind he had once used in combat zones when danger was near. Ethan's pulse quickened. He dropped to his knees beside him, mud soaking into his jeans, and brushed aside handfuls of dirt with his bare hands. Beneath the wet earth, his fingers scraped something hard, smooth. It was a concrete slab, about 3 feet wide, the edges rimmed with rusted iron. Moss clung to it, slick and green, as if it had been buried for decades. Ethan wiped his hand across the surface, revealing a corroded metal ring bolted into the center. It wasn't a rock. It wasn't natural. It was a hatch, sealed, and forgotten. Shadow barked once, sharp and urgent, then stood with his paws pressed against the slab, his body taut as though waiting for Ethan to understand. Ethan leaned back on his heels, breath heavy. He had thought he'd come here for silence, for rest. But silence here had a pulse, and the ground itself seemed to breathe beneath him. That evening, after he had cleaned mud from his boots and tried unsuccessfully to pry the slab open, Ethan drove into Maplebridge. He told himself it was just for more tools, maybe a crowbar, but the truth was he wanted answers. He found Grace Miller at the small library annex next to the school where she sometimes worked late cataloging books. The library smelled of paper and varnish, warm lamplight spilling across wooden tables. Grace sat with her braid tucked over one shoulder, glasses perched low on her nose as she sorted through a stack of history texts. She looked up when Ethan entered, her brow furrowing in mild surprise. "You again," she said, not unkindly. "What brings you here in the middle of a storm's aftermath?" Ethan hesitated, then set his muddy gloves on the table. "I need to ask you something. About the house. About what happened there." Grace's hazel green eyes darkened. She closed the book in front of her and sat back slowly. "I thought you didn't want to know." "I didn't," Ethan admitted. "But the ground behind my place, there's something buried. A hatch. Shadow found it." She stared at him, lips pressed thin. For a moment he thought she might laugh it off, but instead she folded her hands and leaned forward. 52 years ago, a girl named Lydia Blackwood lived there. She was 14. Her family was one of the wealthiest in Maplebridge. The Blackwoods owned mills, farmland, half the valley. Then one spring night, Lydia vanished. No forced entry, no witnesses, no body. Just gone. Ethan frowned. And nobody looked for her? Of course they did. Some townsfolk did at least. But the Blackwoods, they had power. Within weeks, the sheriff at the time declared Lydia a runaway. The papers ran the story that she'd fled to Boston, maybe New York. People whispered, but no one pressed. And then the whispers stopped because when the Blackwoods wanted silence, they got it. Grace's voice carried a quiet bitterness, the kind that only comes from years of watching truth be buried. She removed her glasses, rubbing at her eyes. "My mother used to tell me Lydia wasn't the type to run away. She was artistic, quiet, but stubborn. She loved to draw. She had a German shepherd named Banner, never went anywhere without him. The night she disappeared, so did the dog. Folks said that was proof she'd left on her own. My mother thought different." Ethan listened, the image forming in his mind. A girl sketching in a hidden room, a dog loyal by her side. His chest tightened involuntarily. Grace noticed his silence. "Why are you asking now?" she said. Ethan considered lying, but found himself saying, "Because the ground gave something back, and I'm starting to think this isn't just about a house, it's about what's beneath it." Grace's expression softened, though worry lingered in her eyes. "Then you should be careful, Ethan Cole. Some stories here never died. They were just buried deep enough that most people stopped digging." As she spoke, an older man shuffled past them in the library, stooping slightly under the weight of years. His name was Earl Jennings, the librarian, a thin man in his 70s with a shock of white hair and large glasses perched crookedly on his nose. He wore a corduroy jacket with elbow patches, his gait slow but steady. Earl had been in Maplebridge his whole life, and his memory was sharper than most. He gave Ethan a lingering look before saying in a voice as dry as the pages around them, "History has a way of clawing itself back to the surface. Best not to stand in its way." Then he returned to shelving books without another word. Ethan left the library with Grace's words in his head and the sound of Shadow's bark in his ears. That night, back at the house, he stood at the window watching the rainwater glisten over the slab in the yard. The wind carried a faint scent of iron. Shadow lay by the door, ears pricked toward the backyard as if waiting for permission to dig again. Ethan tried to sleep, but the sound returned, the scraping, the deliberate cack. Cack now from both the floorboards above the basement and the ground outside. He pressed his palms over his ears, but silence would not come. He had thought the house might bury his ghosts, but instead it seemed to have unearthed another's. The house groaned like an old ship in the night, each gust of wind against the siding making the timbers creak in protest. Ethan stood in the basement, the beam of his lantern flickering against the rough stone walls. The storm had passed, leaving the ground soaked and the air heavy with dampness, but the unease it carried lingered. The section of wall Shadow had always fixated on loomed before him now. The bulge in the mortar lines looked almost deliberate, as though someone had built it not to last, but to hide. Shadow paced behind him at the bottom of the stairs, claws clicking against the cement floor. His fur bristled, amber eyes fixed with an intensity that made Ethan feel like the dog was giving orders. For 7 years, Shadow had been his partner in war zones, his instincts sharper than any weapon. When Shadow said there was something wrong, Ethan had learned never to argue. He shifted the crowbar in his hands, wedged it between the warped stones, and pulled. The first strike echoed like thunder in the confined space. Mortar crumbled, dust filling the air. Ethan coughed, his scarred hands steady even as fine grit burned his eyes. Piece by piece, the wall yielded. Chunks of stone fell with hollow thuds, landing in piles around his boots. Behind them, darkness waited, a cavity sealed away for decades. The smell that seeped out wasn't rot. It was the must of long-closed air, mixed with faint char, as if fire had once licked across paper here. When the hole was wide enough, Ethan leaned inside, sweeping the lantern beam through the space. It was small, barely 8 feet by 10, a hidden room carved like a pocket behind the wall. Faded wallpaper still clung to the interior, its star patterns yellowed and curling. A narrow desk sat beneath a boarded-up window, its surface scarred by time. Against the far wall rested a twin bed frame, its mattress long gone, only rusted springs left like a cage. Crayon drawings still clung to the plaster above it, stick figures, rainbows, a clumsy red sun. One drawing showed a small girl holding the paw of a larger dog, beneath which was scribbled in uneven letters, "Me" and "Banner." Ethan's throat tightened. He stepped inside, the floor creaking under his boots. His lantern illuminated a book on the desk, edges curled, half of it charred as though it had survived a fire. He picked it up carefully. It was a diary, the handwriting looping and fragile. He skimmed the entries, most childish and hopeful. Talk of books, her dog, the woods. But as he neared the last pages, the writing grew shaky, almost frantic. The final lines made his pulse freeze. "If I disappear, please believe I did not run away. He will do everything to silence me." Shadow barked suddenly, jerking Ethan back into the present. The sound wasn't his normal alert. It was urgent, furious, a call to action. Ethan dropped the diary back onto the desk and spun toward the noise. The dog had bolted up the basement stairs, claws raking against wood as he sprinted outside. Ethan followed, boots pounding through the hall. He burst onto the back porch into the damp night. The yard glistened, the earth soft from rain. Shadow was at the far corner, the same place he had dug before, barking furiously. The ground there had collapsed further from the storm, a gaping hole where water had dragged away the soil. Ethan slogged through the mud, his lantern swinging wildly. The beam caught pale bone jutting from the earth. Long, slender, unmistakable. Ethan froze, heart hammering in his chest. He dropped to his knees, brushing away clumps of mud with trembling fingers. The soil fell away to reveal more bones, ribs half exposed, the curve of a skull with teeth clenched in eternal silence. Beside it, caught in the roots of a half-buried maple sapling, glimmered a chain. Ethan pulled it free, mud streaking his hands. A small silver locket, its hinges corroded, but the initials were still legible, LB. The weight of the moment pressed against his ribs. Lydia Blackwood, the girl Grace had spoken of. She hadn't run away. She had been here all along, buried in the soil of the house that had been built to silence her. Shadow whimpered now, his growl gone, as if even he understood the gravity of what they had uncovered. Ethan clutched the locket in his fist, knuckles white, staring at the skeletal remains beneath him. His chest burned with questions, fury, and the chilling realization that he was standing in the middle of a story that the town had spent half a century trying to forget. That night, Ethan didn't sleep. He sat at the kitchen table with the diary and the locket laid out before him. Shadow lay at his feet, restless, shifting with unease. The lantern cast shadows across the walls, elongating them until they looked like figures standing watch. Ethan poured himself black coffee that had long gone cold and stared at the last entry again. "He will do everything to silence me." The words gnawed at him. Who was he? A father? A brother? Someone else in the Blackwood household? Grace's voice echoed in his head, her warnings, her insistence that Lydia had not been the type to flee. He realized now she had been right all along. Lydia had been erased not by choice, but by force. The next day, Ethan drove back into Maplebridge. He needed answers, and Grace was the only one who seemed willing to give them. He found her outside the school, her long wool coat belted tight, hair pulled back in its usual braid. Her eyes widened when she saw him striding toward her, mud still clinging to his boots. "Something happened," she said quietly, sensing his urgency before he spoke. "I found her," Ethan replied, his voice rough. "Bones, a locket, with her initials." Grace's face drained of color. She leaned against the railing for balance, her knuckles pale as she gripped it. "After all these years," she whispered, "they left her there." She gestured for him to follow her into the small teacher's lounge where no children would overhear. As she poured him tea, her hands trembled. "My mother told me once," she began, "that Lydia had confided in her about someone in her family, someone cruel, someone who controlled everything. But she was too afraid to say more. Then she vanished, and my mother was warned not to speak of it again. The Blackwoods, they were untouchable. They owned the sheriff, the mayor, half the town, and people stayed silent because silence kept them safe." Ethan stared into the steaming mug, jaw tight. He had come here to bury his own grief, not to exhume someone else's. But now the ground itself had forced him into it. At that moment, the door creaked open and an older woman stepped inside, gray hair pinned in a tight bun, a faded floral dress under her cardigan. This was Martha Bicknell, a retired nurse who volunteered at the school. She was petite, her back slightly stooped, but her blue eyes sharp despite her age. She paused when she saw Ethan, studying him with a recognition that unsettled him. "You're living in the Renford place," she said, her voice crisp. Ethan nodded cautiously. Martha's gaze flickered to Grace, then back. "Then you found her." Ethan stiffened. "You knew?" Martha sighed, lowering herself into a chair. "I was a nurse at the time. The night Lydia disappeared, there were whispers she'd been hurt badly. But when I asked questions, I was told by the sheriff to forget it. When the Blackwoods say forget, you forget." She looked down at her trembling hands. "I didn't. I've lived with that silence for 50 years. Grace reached across the table, squeezing Martha's hand. "It's not too late to tell the truth." Martha's eyes glistened. "No, but it may be too late for justice. The ones responsible are long gone or shielded by their family's name. But if you've found her, then maybe Maplebridge will finally remember." That night, Ethan returned to the house, more burdened than before. The locket lay heavy in his pocket, the diary heavier in his mind. Shadow stayed close, his body tense as if waiting for another command. Ethan stared out the window at the yard where the soil had collapsed. He knew he couldn't stop here, not when Lydia's silent voice was louder now than his own ghosts. He had stumbled into a graveyard of truth, and it had chosen him to dig deeper. And still, from the basement wall, faint as breath, came that steady scrape, as though the house itself whispered, "Not finished." The news spread faster than Ethan could have imagined. By the end of the week, whispers turned into conversations in Maplebridge's cafes, the church foyer, even the narrow aisles of the general store. "He found her," someone muttered as he passed by, heads tilting in his direction. Lydia Blackwood's name, silent for 50 years, was on every tongue again. But where some voices carried relief, others dripped with hostility. The Blackwood family still had roots in Vermont, though the old mansion they once ruled from stood abandoned. The heirs lived in more modern estates in nearby Burlington, but their presence lingered, their money quietly threading through the banks, the town council, and the law. The one who came forward first was Edwin Blackwood, a man in his early 50s. He was tall, broad across the chest, his hair black streaked with iron gray, his face angular and carefully groomed. His suits were tailored, his shoes polished so brightly they reflected the lamplight. He carried himself with the smooth arrogance of someone who had never been told no and meant to keep it that way. Edwin arrived unannounced one afternoon in a black sedan that idled like a watchful animal in Ethan's driveway. He stepped out, accompanied by Martin Keene, a family lawyer who was in his late 60s, stooped but sharp-eyed, with thinning white hair combed neatly back and a briefcase that seemed like a weapon more than a tool. Shadow bristled immediately, standing rigid on the porch with his ears flat and a low growl in his throat. "You've made quite the mess," Edwin said, his voice smooth as silk and just as cold. digging up bones, making accusations. Do you know the damage you're doing? Not just to my family's name, but to this entire town." Ethan leaned on the porch railing, his face impassive, though his heart pounded. "I didn't make anything up. I found her. Lydia didn't run away." Edwin's jaw tightened. "What you found is a relic. A tragedy, yes, but not what you're trying to make it. My family has done nothing but support this valley for generations. You're a soldier with nothing better to do than spin stories." Martin opened his briefcase and slid a sealed envelope across the porch railing toward Ethan. "A notice," the lawyer said. "Defamation. If you continue spreading falsehoods, we will take this to court. You won't win, Mr. Cole. Men like you never do." Ethan didn't touch the envelope. He stared at it until Edwin took it back, sliding it neatly under his arm. The lawyer gave him a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You want peace, Mr. Cole?" Edwin asked. "Drop it. Seal the ground again. Let the past rot where it belongs." They left without waiting for a response, their sedan purring back down the gravel road. Shadow's growl lingered in the air long after the sound of the engine had faded. That evening, Ethan found Grace waiting on his porch. She stood with her braid damp from the mist, wearing a navy peacoat and holding a bundle of papers against her chest. Her expression was grim but steady. "They'll try to bury it all over again," she said before he could speak. "The Blackwoods always have." She opened the bundle, revealing drawings crude but vibrant, done in crayons by her students. "I told them about Lydia, just her story, not the details. I wanted them to know that truth matters, even when people are afraid. They drew these for you, for her." One drawing showed a girl and a dog under a sun that beamed down like a watchful eye. Another showed a gravestone with flowers, a child's handwriting scrawled, "She is remembered." Ethan's chest tightened. He had expected ridicule, not support. Grace's voice softened. "They don't see you as a man chasing ghosts. They see you as the one willing to stand up for someone who was silenced. That matters." Her conviction struck him. She reminded him of the Marines he had led, the way they had carried each other even when everything was falling apart. Grace had a gentleness, but beneath it there was steel, the kind forged from loss. He knew her brother's death had carved a hollow in her life. Maybe that was why she understood his battle so instinctively. The next days were harder. At the general store, Hank Doyle avoided his eyes. Lorna Pike muttered under her breath that stirring old bones would bring curses. Even Earl Jennings at the library looked at him with pity, murmuring about battles too heavy for one man to fight. Yet Grace wasn't alone in standing with him. A few younger townsfolk left jars of daisies on his porch, quiet acknowledgments that someone believed. One night, Martha Bicknell came by. The retired nurse carried herself carefully, her cardigan buttoned to her chin, her cane tapping against the porch steps. "I should have spoken long ago," she confessed, "but I was afraid. Everyone was. If you go forward with this, they will fight you, but if you stop, she'll be forgotten again. You have to decide what you can live with." Ethan sat awake for hours after she left. Shadow sprawled at his feet, staring at the locket on the table. He wanted silence, nothing more. He had bought this place to escape, to bury his grief in rotting wood and broken shingles. Instead, the house had given him a different burden, one heavier than his own ghosts. The diary's last line returned to him again and again. "He will do everything to silence me." The breaking point came when Shadow woke him at 3 a.m., barking sharply at the backyard. Ethan stepped onto the porch with his rifle slung across his shoulder. His boots crunched on wet grass. By the dim glow of the lantern, he saw tire tracks cutting across the mud near the tree line, too fresh to be old. Someone had come onto his land in the night. He crouched, touching the tracks with his hand, the cold mud soaking into his palm. His jaw set hard. The Blackwoods weren't going to let him rest. They were sending messages already. The following morning, Grace visited again, this time with a boy trailing shyly behind her. He was about 12, lanky, with freckles across his cheeks and sandy hair that fell into his eyes. He carried a sketchbook under his arm, clutching it nervously. "This is Noah Ellis," Grace introduced. "One of my students." Noah nodded awkwardly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Miss Miller told us about Lydia. I drew something." He held out his sketchbook, a drawing of the Renford house, with a girl and a German shepherd drawn in bold lines standing outside it, almost like guardians. Ethan studied it, throat tight. "That's good work, Noah." The boy's shoulders relaxed a fraction. "I think she'd want people to see her, not just forget." Then he glanced at Grace and added softly, "Like my dad." Grace touched his shoulder, her eyes wet. Ethan didn't ask, but later she told him. Noah's father had died in an accident at the mill, covered up as negligence to save the owner's money. The boy's quiet anger had become part of who he was. That night, Ethan sat at the kitchen table again, shadow curled nearby, the lantern sputtering low. The envelope from Edwin Blackwood lay unopened beside the diary, the locket resting atop it like a challenge. He could walk away. He could bury it all, pretend he never found the room, the bones, the truth. Silence would keep him safe. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw Lydia's crayon drawings. He saw the trembling letters in her diary. "Believe I did not run away." He saw Grace's students drawing sons and dogs and writing "She is remembered." He saw Noah's shy face trying to turn his father's erasure into something visible. Ethan clenched his fists. He had run from enough ghosts. He whispered into the silence, "They buried her. I won't." Shadow lifted his head, amber eyes glinting in the dim light, as though he understood. The choice had been made. Ethan wasn't going to bury the truth. He was going to drag it into the light, no matter who tried to stop him. The morning air in Maple Bridge carried the sharp bite of early autumn. Mist still clung to the riverbanks, and the fields wore a thin veil of frost. But the town itself felt warmer, restless. Ethan stood at the steps of the courthouse, Shadow sitting tall at his side, amber eyes sweeping the crowd that had gathered. He hadn't intended to become the center of anything, but here he was, a Marine who had come to bury his grief and instead unearthed someone else's. The evidence was laid out in careful order. Lydia Blackwood's diary, brittle pages protected in clear sleeves, the locket marked with LB, photographs of the hidden room behind the wall, and the corroded slab unearthed in the backyard. Grace stood nearby, her coat belted against the chill, her braid falling loosely down her shoulder. She carried herself with quiet dignity, but Ethan could see the strain in her eyes. He had seen that look in soldiers, the weight of truth pressing on a body already tired. Inside, the town sheriff, Daniel Mercer, prepared to address the crowd and the handful of reporters who had driven in from Burlington and Montpelier. Mercer was a broad man in his late 40s, square jaw hidden behind a short beard flecked with gray, his uniform worn but tidy. He had grown up in Maple Bridge, had gone away to work in state law enforcement, and returned after his father's death to run for sheriff. He had a reputation for fairness, though some said he avoided fights with the town's older families. Today, his voice carried the gravity of someone who knew he could no longer avoid this one. "The remains recovered from the coal property," Mercer announced, his tone slow and deliberate, "have been identified through forensic analysis as belonging to Lydia Blackwood. She was not a runaway, as was long believed, but a victim. Evidence suggests foul play. An investigation points directly to her father, Edmund Blackwood." Gasps moved through the crowd. Some people shook their heads in disbelief. Others murmured words that had lain unsaid for decades. Edwin Blackwood, who had appeared again in his polished sedan, stood stiff at the edge of the crowd, his jaw locked, eyes burning holes into Ethan's back. "For too long," Mercer continued, "silence has been used as a shield in this town. That ends today." Reporters raised questions, flashes burst from cameras, and Ethan felt the ground shift under him. He hadn't wanted this storm, but it had come, and he had chosen to stand inside it. That evening, back at the house, Ethan sat at the kitchen table with Shadow lying close, head on his paws. Grace arrived with a basket of bread wrapped in linen, a simple gesture, but her expression told him she was carrying more than food. "You did it," she said softly. "You gave her back her name." "She gave it back herself," Ethan replied, tapping the diary on the table. "I just made sure someone listened." Shadow stirred then, rising to his feet, ears pricked toward the back door. Ethan frowned. Not again. The dog moved with deliberate steps, whining low, then darted out into the yard. Ethan and Grace followed, lantern light cutting through the twilight. Shadow stopped near the collapsed soil where the bones had been found, but this time he didn't dig in the same place. He moved a few yards to the right, sniffed, then began scraping furiously at the ground. Mud flew in clumps, and soon Ethan's hands joined in, pulling aside earth until his fingers struck metal. They unearthed a small tin box, rusted but intact, its lid sealed with what remained of waxed paper. Ethan carried it inside, pried it open carefully with his knife. Inside were folded pages, smudged but legible, a bundle of drawings tied with faded string, and at the bottom, a birth certificate. Grace leaned closer, her breath catching as she lifted the certificate with trembling hands. The name scrawled across it read, "Child of Lydia Blackwood, father, unknown." Her eyes filled with tears. "My grandmother's name, it matches." She pressed a hand to her mouth, staring at Ethan with disbelief and dawning recognition. "She never told us. She never knew. I'm her granddaughter." The revelation crashed over them both. Grace's connection to Lydia wasn't just sympathy, it was blood, a thread of family stretched across half a century of silence. For a long moment, the only sound in the kitchen was the hiss of the lantern and Shadow's steady breathing. Ethan felt a strange warmth in his chest, something he hadn't known in years, the sense of belonging. He had come here alone, hollowed by war and loss, but the house had given him something he hadn't sought, a new family, forged not by choice but by truth. In the weeks that followed, Maple Bridge transformed. The old Renford house became something more than a ruin. Volunteers came to clean and restore the hidden room, sealing the crayon drawings beneath protective glass. Children from Grace's class brought flowers, jars of wild daisies lined along the porch rail. Someone painted a wooden sign that read, "Lydia's Corner, she is remembered." Even those who had once muttered curses now walked the gravel path in silence, leaving small offerings, newspaper clippings, folded notes, sketches of a girl and her dog. It was not penance, but it was acknowledgement, and that was more than had existed for 50 years. Ethan would sometimes sit on the porch with Shadow at his feet, watching as strangers paused with bowed heads. Grace often joined him, her presence steady, her laughter softening the edges of his hardened silence. They had both lost family, but now found themselves tied by one. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the hills, Ethan reached down to scratch behind Shadow's ear. The dog tilted his head, eyes glowing amber in the fading light. "You found her," Ethan murmured. "You found all of us." Shadow gave a low, contented huff, laying his head back down against Ethan's boot, as though to say his mission was complete. For the first time in years, Ethan felt peace settle into his bones. Not the silence of forgetting, but the quiet of truth finally spoken, of ghosts laid to rest. He looked at the house, its broken walls now carrying the weight of memory rather than shame, and whispered to himself, "I thought I came here for silence, but what I found was family." Sometimes the deepest truths are buried, not under soil, but under silence. Lydia's story reminds us that every voice matters, and every life deserves to be remembered. In our own lives, we may not uncover hidden rooms or long-lost diaries, but we all face moments where choosing honesty, compassion, and courage can change everything. If this story touched your heart, please share it so others may hear it too. Leave a comment below with your thoughts, and if you believe that no one should ever be forgotten, write Amen. Do not forget to subscribe so you never miss the next story of hope and truth. May God bless you and your loved ones, and may His light guide us all toward remembering, healing, and standing for what is right.